Welcome back, Truth Seekers. My name is Michael Parker. This is Dark Matter on KarmaAir.com. It is Sunday, Mother's Day. It's about 20 after 5 here in Los Angeles, California. And as promised, today we have a guest that I'm very happy to have on today. He is Dr. Nick Begich. He's the eldest son of late United States Congressman from Alaska, Nick Begich Sr., and political activist Pegge Begich. He's well known in Alaska for his political activities. He was twice elected president of both the Alaska Federation of Teachers and the Anchorage Council of Education. He's been pursuing independent research in the sciences and politics for most of his adult life. Begich received his doctorate in traditional medicine from the Open International University for Complementary Medicines in November 1994. He co-authored with Gene Manning the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP, Advances in Tesla Technology, which we'll be discussing today. Begich also authored Earthrising, The Revolution Towards 1,000 Years of Peace, and his latest book, Earthrising 2, The Betrayal of Science, Society, and the Soul, both with James Roderick. Nick is going to be here in the Los Angeles area this coming week. He will be speaking, I believe, both Monday and Tuesday night at MUFON LA Tuesday night in the Valley in Studio City, and I believe Monday night, he can correct me on this if it's not correct, at the Orange County MUFON LA. And his speech, his lecture that evening will primarily be about exotic technology for mind control. So without further ado, I would like to invite Nick onto the show. How are you doing, Dr. Begich?
I'm doing great, and actually it's Tuesday and Wednesday I'll be lecturing.
Of course, there you go. Tuesday and Wednesday. Well, you guys, if you're in the Southern California area, I would please invite you to come out to either MUFON LA or Orange County. I am a member of MUFON Los Angeles. I will be there, and it's great people, and I think you guys will enjoy it. I've heard Nick speak many times on the radio, and I'm sure it will be fascinating. Nick, I wanted to ask you, you've done a lot of work. You're a very busy man, and a lot of what you deal with is quite heady. How did you get involved with your initial research on HAARP?
Well, it was I had read a short article in a Australian publication, and it just caught my eye because it was only 5 column inches, but it talked about this project here in Alaska. And you know, this is a big state, but a small population. We had heard nothing about it, and the article was pretty outrageous. So it really caused me to look into the subject, see what was in the record here, in the public record, and then speaking with some of the environmental groups and realizing really no one was looking at it. And I guess one thing led to another. Eventually we had a pretty good pile of source material on the project. It seemed important enough to really get something written about it, and I published the first article on the subject, and that, of course, caused me to meet Gene Manning, who became my co-author on the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP, which was, you know, about 350 source documents, I think, when we finished on the project itself. And
that came out in 95, right?
Right. And this is about the same, in fact, the same month, Popular Science had an article on HAARP, and there was, you know, it started a pretty big controversy just in terms of what it was, and really part of a whole new direction for weapons technologies was taking place at the time, moving away from bullets and bombs more to energy-based technologies, and HAARP was just one part of that.
Well, let's explain to our listeners, because we've spoken about HAARP on the show in the past, but not at length. HAARP stands for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. Now, the program began in 1990, is that correct?
More or less. There were some initiatives that go back to even to the mid-'80s, but when you look at the project from its inception, it was Dr. Ben Eastland who first fielded the idea of really looking for a way to market gas on the North Slope of Alaska. There was and there is to this day huge supplies of natural gas on the North Slope, and there's still not yet a pipeline. And at that time, ARCO had a major portion of that, and Ben Eastland believed that you could actually turn it into electricity, then turn it into radio frequency energy and push it through a whole field of antennas and create a number of weapons effects. And it was, you know, it was a pretty interesting technology, and that really began what later became the HAARP program.
Now, Ben Eastland, I was not aware of this gentleman until I started looking at your work, and of course he's from Texas. But I'm from Texas as well, so no slag, but it didn't surprise me, and I grew up in the oil business as well. But was his idea initially to use HAARP to look underground for pockets that could contain natural gas? Is that what initially how he was wanting to use it? Or was he wanting to look for the gas and create the electricity and then beam it into the air?
Well, he was looking at the gas is pretty well known. I mean, there's trillions of cubic feet that are known on the North Slope, and what they were looking for was a way to just sell it right where it was. And so this weapons application, which would use a fair amount of gas and a large amount of power, was where that whole concept began. But Eastland was also looking at this one application which would give you some imaging capability, what's called earth penetrating tomography. This whole concept of kind of looking into the earth, or if you were to compare it, it'd be like similar to the same kind of concept as X-raying the earth by analogy. And so, that certainly was part of the project. In fact, if you think about this thing with water on Mars, they've imaged the polar regions and determined there's water going down a couple kilometers deep. And, I mean, if you can image for water on Mars, you can definitely image for oil and gas on Earth. And this is what Ben Eastland eventually was able to test this idea, as well as a number of others, and they proved it worked quite effectively. Earth-penetrating tomography as a concept does, in fact, give you that ability to image at pretty good distances and pretty good depths.
Well, since you're living in Alaska, how close are you actually to the HAARP installation?
I'm about 250 miles southwest of the facility, actually.
Now, is the facility, if a civilian were to want to go up there and see it, how close could they get to the actual facility, or do they even do tours? I do not know.
Yeah, they do a tour once a year. In August, they generally run an open house and do their sort of dog and pony show and let you go out there and take a look at what's going on. But you can get fairly close to it within a couple of, I'd say probably couple thousand feet at the most from the furthest part of the array. You can fly fairly close to it aerially and get a pretty good view of it as well.
Well, when I was doing my research on this, I mean, I've heard, several rumors as to things that may have occurred as a result of HAARP or not. But one thing I think we should start off with for the listeners is maybe if you could tell us what HAARP actually is, and also explain a little bit about the ionosphere, so people can kind of get some background on this.
You bet. The HAARP system was essentially designed to perturb or manipulate certain aspects of the environment, including the magnetic field lines which surround the Earth. They start at the South Pole, and the energy flows to the North Pole, intersecting at the poles and being the furthest out at the equator. The ionosphere is a layer that begins approximately 30 miles out and extends for several hundred miles beyond that. And it's an energized area. It's fueled essentially by the energy of the sun. But the ionosphere, if it's disturbed by, like during solar activity, it disrupts communication, can even interfere, for instance, with the power grid. So studying the ionosphere and figuring out ways to stabilize it or manipulate it during these times is one of the sort of areas of research for a long time. But with HAARP offered a unique possibility because it's so big and has the capability of literally modulating or causing the ionosphere to pulse in sympathetic resonance, essentially, to the signal off the ground. So you can manipulate its character, and that can be used, for instance, for knocking out communications over large areas, while at the same time being able to carry your own communications, because you would be able to modulate it in such a way where this could be achieved. The other things that come up, manipulation of the magnetic field lines in terms of pumping energy in. One of Eastland's ideas was that you could then create a very highly energized area, because the magnetic field lines would act like waveguides and send the energy from the North Pole, kind of corkscrewing its way down the magnetic field lines to the South Pole. And any, say, intercontinental ballistic missile or satellite or anything else that was electronically equipped that went through that area would be disturbed and would malfunction, basically because of interference with its computers and flight controls, the microcircuits that keep all of that stuff running.
Well, I know that there are several of these installations, not just in the U.S. There's the European incoherent scatter. I guess
Right.
that's what you call it. And there's also the one in Russia, the Sura ionospheric heating facility. What is the primary difference between HAARP and those installations?
Well, size mainly and versatility. HAARP can be change frequency very rapidly. It's much larger. It has the ability to be able to fire in a very specific sequence to create a pretty powerful cyclotron resonance. But the biggest issue was the eventual power levels, which are projected up to 1 billion watts. Right now, it's about half the size of where they want to eventually be with it. It's 180 antenna in the array, getting ready to charge those up sometime late this summer or this fall.
And when you say they're getting ready to do this summer or fall, how often is the installation down? I guess it's not actually working. I mean, how often is it on and how often is it off as far as what they're doing?
Well, most of it's intermittent use. It's through short campaigns, although there's engineering and field tests that are unannounced and go on periodically. Some of that is, who knows. But in terms of full-time status, no, this system was never intended to operate that way as far as we can see.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, there's no real independent monitoring either to determine how much testing is really going on at the facility.
That's key, what you just said, independent monitoring. And I guess the people at HAARP and the government are always quick to say that what we're doing here is not a dangerous thing. It's not invasive to the ionosphere because it doesn't match the amount of energy that's actually coming from the sun. But it would seem to me like the difference is that you're talking about this energy being pinpointed in one particular place as opposed to being around the whole sphere of the planet.
Well, what it is as well is it's not just focusing the energy or concentrating to a relatively small area. It's being able to modulate it with a coherent signal and then use the natural nature of the ionosphere sort of as part of that. It's like a primer on a bullet. You've got a lot of energy in the ionosphere. If you can get that energy to do certain things because of its manipulation on the ground, then you have something. And while it's true, it's a small amount of energy compared to the sun. The sun doesn't generate coherent signals. It generates, random energy exchanges. A coherent signal has the ability to couple with existing parts of our system and then cause energy to be released. For instance, VLF, very low frequency energy, was discovered at Stanford when pumped up into the ionosphere. In certain frequency ranges, the energy would actually amplify in the ionosphere by up to 1,000 times in terms of power concentration. And that wasn't because the energy on the ground was so powerful. It just coupled with a certain resonance within the ionosphere that allowed energy that was there to be released in a more direct or controlled kind of way. And so when you think about this instrument on the ground, think about it as a tuning instrument, if you will, something that can cause energy exchanges in a place where there's plenty, an inordinate amount of energy available.
We are speaking with Dr. Nick Begich. We are talking about HAARP, which is the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. And so this thing, it went online in the early 90s. Your book came out in 95, and I would say your book has got to be probably the most well-known book regarding HAARP. How do the people of Alaska feel about HAARP these days?
Well, there's not a whole lot of discussion, actually. It's kind of gone to the point where no one really looks at it. I suppose if we ever have a serious incident, and this year, for instance, just recently in March, they did the announcements for increasing power because they have finally installed the antenna that they wanted for some time. But in order to power it up, they need more power, and they've got to go through this permitting process. So we know that's going to occur. Eventually, it depends on really what kind of effects they generate and what sort of concerns. It's a sparsely populated area, and so one of the big problems is you can't really get a lot of analysis, and there's not, as I say, any independent monitoring for what is happening. When you look at some of the things within the literature and some of the things that are giving people greater concern is HAARP can be used, for instance, to manipulate gravitational waves. And it was just determined that the amount of energy necessary, for instance, to affect weather systems might be as little as 1,600 times less energy than what Dr. Eastland originally anticipated for HAARP. And that's based on his latest work that he presented in 2005 at the University of Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of concern about sort of the earlier issues, but being looked at from a much different perspective today, just based on new knowledge and things that continue to come out in the literature.
Mm-hmm. Have you met Eastland?
Yeah, actually, I know Ben fairly well, and he's not a bad guy, actually. Everyone specializes to the point where they miss a lot of the things. And I know that in recent years, as Ben's become more aware of sort of where this technology can go, a much more careful consideration about how he advances science and in what areas he spends his time. And fortunately, there's a lot of people in science, especially the best in science, that actually have a little bit of flexibility in terms of what they want to do in life.
Mm-hmm. So he's a good guy, but he's doing his work. The reason I wanted to ask you that is just because what we're talking about here is, of course, as you well know, we're talking about technologies that are somewhat frightening and have incredible implications.
Absolutely.
So when I try to put myself inside the mind of a man who's coming up with this kind of technology, I just am curious of what type of individual he is.
Yeah, with Ben, when you first looked at it, what were the things that were jumping out for him? Well, first, a missile defense system.
Yes.
And that was the big deal, when you first looked at the project, was how can we develop a system that will, in fact, stop everything that could be incoming. And, in that sense, it was a great concept. The other issue that was interesting, I think, was the oil and gas exploration.
Certainly.
That, I think from a national perspective, it'd be nice to identify all of our resources, even within the United States, here in Alaska particularly. But when you start to look at some of the more sinister issues, the issue of effects on human beings, this is an area of biophysics that I know when Eastland first looked at it, it's just flat outside of his area of expertise. And this is one of the problems that he actually has started to point out to many other scientists, is the idea that, without this cross-fertilization between disciplines, a lot of things get missed, and things that you would never, ever want to see happen end up perhaps being more of a central focus to a program than you ever figured, and more than that than you ever knew could even be possible. And so I think, the model we've used in the U.S., one of compartmentalization and separation in science, has really caused other kinds of problems, and at the same time missed perhaps some pretty good opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at Soviet research in the area back, during the Cold War, they did the opposite. They used cross-disciplinary teams, set different thresholds, and innovated in ways, particularly in biophysics, where we just never even today, I don't believe, catching up.
Well, you mentioned initially that ARCO was part of this, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that their initial reason for wanting to be part of this was the oil and gas exploration aspect. But then it got sold, correct?
Yeah, this is interesting because ARCO Power Technologies, Inc., the subsidiary that was doing this, and ARCO itself, ARCO sold all its resources out, and ConocoPhillips ended up on the North Slope. But the Earth-penetrating tomography and the patents that went with it sold eventually to E-Systems, which was a super secret kind of company based primarily in Washington, D.C. Then it sold to Raytheon Corporation and eventually sold to British Aerospace. And the system, HAARP itself on the ground, switched from a university project to a strict with Navy and Air Force support to Navy and Air Force only, and then over to DARPA, which is dealing with just defense research projects that are mainly of a classified nature. And so, we saw that kind of transition with the company that owned the patents and what happened, sort of where they got buried. But HAARP advances. HAARP's moving forward. It continues to get funded. The research that's being developed, I think, has gone in the direction that they had hoped. They've been able to perfect a lot of concepts and ideas, and now we see the systems being advanced even in Canada, Europe, and literally around the world. And the question is, for many, is, without with the lack of civilian oversight, some of the concerns are that we'll cross thresholds and create instabilities or runaway effects, as the military describes them, that may not be so easily stabilized.
You guys were speaking with Dr. Nick Begich. My name is Michael Parker. You're listening to Dark Matter. We're talking about HAARP. We will be back in just a moment. And Nick, right before we left, we were talking about the various hands that HAARP had kind of passed through, that it initially started with ARCO, wound up with Raytheon. Is there any oil and gas exploration still being done with HAARP at all?
It's no one's really talking about it, but in terms of the technology, it would be easy to accomplish for quite a large area in the area that it's operating in. The idea of using ground-penetrating tomography for isolating oil and gas fields is something that is technology that now is fairly well known and is pretty accurate, in fact, very accurate, from reports by some of the experts we've interviewed over the years. Brooks Agnew, one in point, we talked to him even in the last few months, and Brooks' attitude is, you could actually make determination of oil and gas fields over the entire North Slope, and what they already know is there's sufficient oil and gas supplies there to last our country many, many decades, and yet there's not, with perfect information, and that's where this gets kind of interesting, is if you could do this safely and develop the information, then you would not be drilling wildcat kind of wells. You would be doing it with certainty and perfect information. And there's some new ideas about hydrocarbons, that they're not fossil fuels, and we find hydrocarbons on lots of other moons and planets, even in our own solar system. So there's a question as to, whether there really is a shortage. On the North Slope, they figure just in methane hydrate, there's 450 trillion cubic feet, and that's not including the 60 trillion cubic feet of natural gas below that.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up as well, because I grew up in Texas, in West Texas, in the oil business. My father was an independent oil man, and I tend to believe that, yes, oil is not a creation of decaying dinosaur parts and foliage and what have you. I personally believe that it has to do with the mechanism of the planet itself. Of course, I'm no scientist. This is just my personal feeling, but I do find it somewhat difficult to believe that all of the oil in the planet is the result of decaying biological matter.
Right, and there's some new theories being kicked around. There was a time when, not too many decades ago, in the mid-'60s, where continental drift wasn't considered sane science, and now it's pretty much the norm. In terms of hydrocarbon sources, time will tell, but perhaps the debate that's starting to emerge there will turn itself to be true. But when you look at the North Slope, the Arctic Ocean in particular, the whole thing is essentially an oil and gas basin, which, with the changes that are occurring as a result of climate change, this area is opening up. And you think about the Soviet Far East, the northern regions of Alaska above the Brooks Range, all of that is essentially oil and gas basins. And even within the Bering Sea, they have found methane hydrate plumes that are 1,500 meters across, and there's hundreds of these, and they each contain between 1 and 5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas alone. Wow. Pretty amazing stuff. I mean, and this is like crystallized methane hydrate, because it's deep in the ocean, and it's under such pressure and under such temperatures that it actually crystallizes until it reaches the surface, where it starts to gas off, unless you, of course, could contain it. But amazing situation with energy sources that most people don't even know about. But when you look at systems like HAARP being able to use it, and this is where the whole issue was first pushed forward, was, think about it, if you could make electricity right where it is and plug into the electromagnetic field lines of the planet itself, right where they intersect the Earth in the northern regions of the Earth, how efficient for weapons applications or for other applications that Dr. Eastland envisioned. But again, it's kind of like plugging in to the planet, if you will. And there are some concerns about this in terms of what might create a shunt or a conductor, where energy then coming off of the ionosphere, which is huge amounts of energy potentials, would strike the Earth like the biggest bolt of lightning you've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the concerns, of course, that have been raised by independent scientists about the project.
Well, bolts of lightning make me think of Nikola Tesla, and I wanted to ask you about his work and how much of his work do you think actually inspired what has become HAARP and the other ionospheric heaters that exist on the planet. I'm fascinated by Tesla personally. This gentleman, I mean, he was aware of the dark side that was available to his work, but I think that he was trying initially to be of service to the planet, not of a destructive nature.
Yeah.
How much of his work, the ideas behind like his teleforce, which we never really saw that we know of, how much of that do you think eventually became part of HAARP?
Well, Tesla was an inspiration to Eastland. You referenced those articles that referred to that teleforce back from the old New York Times articles. They show up as references within the patents themselves. And, Tesla was essentially working with alternating currents, manipulating them in a specific way. And what you have with HAARP is the ability to change the ionosphere itself from DC to an AC to an alternating current. Wow. And then by manipulating it, and this is where the gravitational waves, long wavelengths that can have maybe a much different effect of ringing the planet or transferring energy very efficiently through the planet, where then you could tap it off anywhere for pretty much for free. And this kind of concept was out there with Tesla, but it was really about manipulating energy that was already available through principles of resonance that could be achieved through alternating currents. And this is, again, where it's, the military keeps wanting to downplay, the sun is so much more powerful. Well, it's like a scattergram, of energy. It doesn't amount to anything unless it's directed and controlled in ways that can create these kinds of unusual coupling effects. And that's where systems like HAARP come in, and that's where the correlations to the work of Tesla also come in, because it's all about resonant energy and being able to capitalize on natural energy that's already available.
Now, the ionosphere, explain this to myself and the audience a little bit. The ionosphere starts, about 5 miles off the planet?
Even a little bit further out.
Okay.
I mean, but basically it's an energy. What you have for, when you think about these pictures of the Earth, you see this first an energy field that surrounds the Earth and kind of tails out on the down sun, not the sun side, but the opposite side of the planet, like a tadpole almost. And it's where the energy of the sun kind of blows over the planet. And then under this outer layer is the magnetosphere. Under it is the ionosphere, a little bit more spherical, although still with a little bit of a bulge on one side. And then you get underneath that the various layers of atmosphere. And the ionosphere, essentially being fueled by the energy of the sun, contains huge amounts of energy, but it's just kind of random. And when it fluctuates or is altered by the sun's discharges, it can affect wireless communications, shortwave communications, even affect the energy grid itself. And so the sun, as it feeds this sort of power supply, causes certain oscillations or changes that sometimes are good, and sometimes you get really ideal conditions where you can propagate, for instance, radio signals very efficiently around the planet in terms of shortwave.
And the important thing to understand about the ionosphere, if I'm understanding all this correctly, is basically this is what protects us from the harmful rays of the sun. And given that it seems like we are entering a period of accelerating sunspot activity and solar wind, I mean, the ionosphere is very important to the health of the planet. Right.
In fact, we talk about ozone depletion, letting UV in. The ionosphere screens out particle streams and energies that would make life impossible on this planet without it. I mean, it's very, very vital to everything. And, the fact that it does alter significantly with solar flare activity, and we're hitting this period where we're hitting more intense activity, things like fine electronic circuits and wireless communication. In a wireless world, you can understand the need for stability in this area. And so the experiments with HAARP, at their very root, go back to this idea of what can we do to not only stabilize it, but also perhaps manipulate it for very specific kind of uses. And, the idea of manipulating the energy systems of the planet, and as we're learning more about the planet, we're finding that perhaps then we can alter weather and jet stream flows and all kinds of other factors. And that's, again, where the danger comes in. Because as you look at the research on weather modification as an example, significant material has been developed since HAARP was first envisioned. And, we have a better idea of what's possible here, and even private companies delivering that service. And Congress had a couple of bills last session, to try and regulate some of this. But the idea that the technologies are getting so simple, if you will, that even private companies can offer it, I think we need to be concerned. HAARP systems are huge. They have even greater potential impacts without a whole lot of oversight at all, and much less any downstream sort of understanding of what might occur when we trigger these instabilities.
Wow. You guys, my name is Michael Parker. We are speaking with Dr. Nick Begich. We're talking about HAARP. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. When we come back, I do want to talk with Nick about the implications for weather modification and also mind control.
For Dark Matter with Michael Parker.
I love America. We all love America. But now it's time to demonstrate that love and demonstrate that devotion to the country by standing up and saying, hey, you know what? Halt. Stop. Time out. Let's start thinking again.
This is KarmaAir.com. Internet radio at its best.
This is Richard Roundtree, and you're listening to KarmaAir.com.
You're now listening to Dark Matter with Michael Parker, right here on KarmaAir.com.
Welcome back, Truth Seekers, Paradigm Busters, New World Order, Civil Disobedience, Free Thinkers, good people of all type. How's it going? My name is Michael Parker. Yes, I do love America, and today we are speaking to a great American, Dr. Nick Begich. We are talking about HAARP. We're talking about the implications for this technology, what it is, what it can do, why we might want to be concerned. Nick, before we left, we were beginning to talk about the idea of utilizing this for weather modification.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that. That concerns us.
Well, there's a couple ways. Firstly, they used to call the old versions of these devices ionosphere heaters because they would literally heat an area about 30 miles in diameter, and then you could push by heating that area out a couple hundred kilometers, which would then cause the atmosphere in that area to rush in, fill that empty space. A couple of purposes for that, but the immediate implication is you can then alter pressure systems within the region and also alter the direction and flow of jet streams, which can be pretty dramatic in terms of what happens downstream. And I think we can all identify with that. I mean, when you think about real strange fluctuations in the jet stream, what that causes and weather disturbances throughout the United States, it's pretty obvious to see why that's an important issue. The other place is when you push that atmosphere out and it fills that void. Any low-orbiting satellite, for instance, that were to encounter that atmosphere would, of course, encounter friction and burn up. The same is true with any incoming, say, space debris or a comet or even an asteroid. If you could project the trajectory, instead of having, say, 30 miles of atmosphere, you might be able to push out a couple hundred miles of atmosphere, which means much larger objects would burn up and break up before they ever struck the Earth. And this is one of the applications that comes up both when you talk about weather modification or you talk about this sort of anti-space debris application, which showed up first in the Strategic Studies Institute in London when they were citing some old Russian research dealing with the earlier versions of this device.
Wow. Well, do you know of any particular times that it has been used to modify weather, or are these just rumors?
No, the uses are clear. I mean, the idea that it can be used this way, there was additional work done by Eastland for the European Space Agency, where he did papers on the same thing for interdicting tornadoes, as an example, using HAARP. NASA and FEMA then contracted with him to see if you could do the same thing with space-based lasers, manipulating the heat energy in storm fronts, so you could, neutralize the energy that would otherwise be used for creating that sort of twister formation where you have cold and a warm front coming against each other. Then Eastland's work, of course, University of Pennsylvania in 2005, the work that he presented there was, again, on weather modification. These aren't anymore so much theoretical. Its only question is, again, no independent monitoring. There's one instance, which is kind of, again, a coincidence, I would say, but Scientific America, in an issue in May, I believe it was 2002, the whole issue was dedicated to weather. And in the middle of the section, middle of the magazine, is a discussion of the flow of the jet stream just coincidentally above HAARP, where it took a dog leg to the north and then shot, back east and then back south and then on its way. And what that small change in Alaska above the HAARP facility did is move storm fronts out of East Texas into central Florida, where a couple of tornadoes got delivered to Orlando a number of years ago. And it was a small change in Alaska, and this is the kind of thing you could do with HAARP, is exactly that, is create that kind of a dogleg within the jet stream and then alter its downstream flow. Now, in this instance, no independent monitoring of HAARP would say, yeah, that was what was occurring there, and yet when you look at this is exactly the kind of thing that Dr. Eastland and others have talked about regarding HAARP.
If we were to give these guys the benefit of the doubt, if you're able to create these type of weather systems, could you also undo them? Say you've got a bad hurricane or tornado type situation occurring. Could you stop these using HAARP?
Well, that's one of the things that Eastland theoretically, his models prove out. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it was at the University of Oklahoma that he completed those models just a few months before the tornadoes came through Oklahoma City a few years ago. And if you remember, Clinton stood up and said, hey, don't worry, one of these days we'll figure out how to tame these things and this won't be a problem. Well, people laughed, but that's what actually was the models had shown at the University of Oklahoma right there, was that if you could, for instance, heat up a cold front as it was coming into a warm front where you'd get that shearing action, if you could heat it up and neutralize that energy, then perhaps you could stop tornadoes from forming in the first place. Or, the worry, of course, is if you miss and you heat up the warm front, you create a greater energy differential, than maybe a class 1 becomes a class 4, or something like this. So, when you talk about weather modification, the ideas are well expressed, and Eastland's concern today is, in his latest innovations in the area, he won't even deal with military because he doesn't believe that they will do it safely. It needs to be, if it's done at all, in the open light of day, because these systems are so interconnected. You can't just create one effect somewhere and not expect some unanticipated downstream effect. And this is where the big cautions start to come in, and why many scientists today are saying, wait a minute, if we're going to do any of this, it needs to be very, very slow and very careful and very open, where we don't make mistakes. And I don't know that we're capable of doing that right now. It's kind of like the child with a hand grenade. Do you let him pull the pin? And it's the same kind of analogy in my view. Is we're very early in this science, and we're playing in a realm where you can't sort of put the genie back in the bottle when you make mistakes.
Well, and the fact that you mentioned that there's very little oversight. I mean, is there any oversight at all on this thing?
Within the military itself, and in the funding side, it's also the Congress that has some oversight. But you have to have the right congressman with the requisite science backgrounds to even ask the right questions in those closed conferences, because otherwise they never get asked, and the whole picture is never fully understood.
What is the annual budget for HAARP? Do you know, or?
It's not. It's not really got an annual budget. It's got separate appropriations that keep popping up in different portions of the budget. Sometimes it's funded under non-proliferation, counter-proliferation. Over the years, it's gotten well over 140 million in direct funding, and then ancillary components of it get funded all the time, and then the campaigns themselves, which the various branches of government and academic institutions get separate funding to use the facility. So you see pockets of money showing up in lots of different funding sources under the National Science Foundation, for academic institutions, through the Navy, through the Army, through the Air Force. All of them will run various campaigns at different times utilizing the facility and funding the projects. The initial installations are funded in sort of lump sum congressional appropriations, which allow the facility to grow in kind of quick jumps over the years.
We are speaking with Dr. Nick Begich. We are talking about HAARP. If you are in the Southern California area, please join us at MUFON this week on Tuesday and Wednesday to hear Nick speak. Tuesday night, he will be at the MUFON LA meeting, which is in Studio City at the Unitarian Universalist Church on Moore Park. And on Wednesday, May the 16th, he will be at MUFON Orange County, which is at the Neighborhood Community Center in Costa Mesa. So we hope you will join us out there. I am a member of MUFON LA, so I will definitely be at one of these shows. Nick, with HAARP, it just seems that it's so exotic that, just like you mentioned, I mean, some of the folks that could have oversight, they would have to do their homework to even be able to join the conversation to fully understand the full implications of it.
Right. And, what we did is early on in the 90s, we were able to take the issue into Europe, and the European Parliament became interested. We had a couple of people within the Parliament willing to take the issue on and help us bring it forward. And one of them ended up chairing the Foreign Affairs Committee as a conservative, and prior to that chaired the Environmental Subcommittee, again as a conservative from Great Britain. And so we were able to form eventually a coalition of legislators that were both conservatives, social democrats, and Greens, and were able to get the issue covered within a security and disarmament resolution that essentially was pretty comprehensive. There were just 4 sections dealing with HAARP, but we were able to bring enough evidence forward that was unclassified to prove our point. NATO was invited to debate us. They refused and said they had no policy on either HAARP or non-lethal weapons. And so February 5th, 1998, we presented as an opening document one called Ionospheric Modification for Weapons Applications, produced by NATO France as an unclassified document. And, from there introduced a score of documents and more on this system and what it did. And, the issues for parliamentarians was not so much was really more surprise about what was possible, but they did include in the most comprehensive resolution on disarmament they've ever passed a section, 4 sections on HAARP, including the last section that dealt primarily with this non-lethal weapons, with the effects on human beings of these kinds of systems.
Dennis Kucinich introduced a space weapons bill a few years ago. Was there anything regarding HAARP in that bill?
Originally there was. My understanding is they took it out. It was stripped out before it ever went anywhere, even out of his office. But a lot of it's a lack of understanding. And, the problem is, again, the lack of science understanding independent of the military themselves to advise the Congress. And I think that's been a problem all along. Continues to be a problem even more so today. I mean, when you think about our senior senator from Alaska referring to the internet as a bunch of tubes, as an example, many will remember it. But, this is the guy that was chairman of appropriations and was chair of the military subcommittees and those that were dealing with these kinds of projects, the black aspects of these projects. And, when you got people like that sitting on Senate Intelligence, and it's not that they're not intelligent people, it's just they don't have the requisite training, and there's no one there to ask the questions. And anyone who delves into anything, I mean, I look at myself more as a science reporter, and to ask a good question, you really have to have at least some level of background in order to make an understanding and to ask the right questions.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not there in the Congress.
Well, I also read in some of my research, somebody made the point that some folks thought that HAARP initially was kind of a pork barrel project brought about by Ted Stevens. Is that correct?
Right. That was the original idea that came out in the Washington Post years ago, and when they were first getting funded, because Stevens was out there on the floor of the Senate saying it was just like something out of Jules Verne. He said it'll bring energy, right out of the ether, and allow us to beam it from one place to the planet the other, which actually is within the HAARP patents, but it was quickly dismissed by Akasofu, who was head of the Geophysical Institute at the time. Normally, Stevens would have just, because he's kind of a hot-headed kind of guy, he would have just cut the funding. But it went forward. It got funded. That idea kind of got diminished in the press. But, no, it really wasn't about so much the pork barrel side of it as it was some of the more exotic applications that really weren't meant to be in the public record. And what came out later was a great deal in terms of the contract documents and some of the internal memorandums that eventually made it out into the public that showed a much different system, one more in line with what Stevens was spouting off early on. But, when you deal with these kinds of projects, I mean, it's a lot of money, and at the same time, getting to know Ben Eastland over the years, he had like a 15-year confidentiality agreement with ARCO that finally expired, where he was able to actually publish the timelines and the sequences and some of the internal memorandum that clearly refute what ARCO had said for many years after the project was handed over to the military.
Wow. You guys are speaking with Dr. Nick Begich. We're talking about HAARP. We're going to take a break here in just a second. I also, Nick, when we come back after this break, then I want to get into some of the scarier aspects of this, and I know you're going to be talking about human performance and mind control at the MUFON lectures, and so I don't want to steal your thunder too much on that, but I do want to
get into that. Yeah, absolutely.
Good, because I want people to understand that, because so far when people hear some of this, they might think, well, okay, well, you've mentioned a couple of possible benefits that this technology has, but I want people to fully understand some of the negative sides of this thing. Welcome back, my friends. My name is Michael Parker, and this is Dark Matter on Karma Air. We're speaking with Dr. Nick Begich today. We are talking about HAARP. And Nick, when we left, we were wanting to get in this idea of using this for behavior modification, for mind control. And people will probably think, how would that even be possible? But let's talk about some of the things that you can do with this on the dark side.
Well, on that side of the issue, you got to go back to the work of J.F. Gordon MacDonald back in 1969. He wrote a chapter in a book called Unless Peace Comes. He was a geophysicist at UCLA, was also a science advisor to President Johnson. And what he said is that if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal that the mind would essentially recognize or be able to be locked onto what now we call a frequency following response, where the brain actually begins to mirror that external signal, follow that external signal in a way that changes then brain chemistry. This was something that was later demonstrated by Jose Delgado back in 1985 using radio frequency energy, the stuff of HAARP, essentially. But being able to modulate energy at 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces, which is very small, on the order. In fact, HAARP can produce much more than that. But being able to modulate that energy in a specific way, you could, in fact, change the behavior of people over huge geographic areas. Also, Persinger at Laurentian University wrote a paper about the same time that Angels Don't Play This HAARP came out in 1995. It was about modulating or sending energy into the magnetic field lines of the Earth that would do exactly the same thing. And this is, in fact, what HAARP can do as the largest radio frequency transmitter ever constructed on the planet. Now, whether they'll do it or not, deliberately, is a question. Accidentally, it happens that it's the same range of frequencies that have become effective to the brain as are used, for instance, in Earth-penetrating tomography, this concept of looking into the Earth.
Well, what type of effects would this have on them? What could, for our listeners, what could you make people do, or does it make them sick, or does it make them hallucinate, or aggravated? What can you do to people?
Well, the simpler things, you could affect the various emotional centers of the brain, so you could trigger a sense of dis-ease or anger. You could create a sense of well-being or happiness. I mean, these kinds of effects you could create by modulating very specific signals on the HAARP and using magnetic field lines as sort of the carrier around the planet. These are the concerns that do come up because, in the literature it says that maybe it would only affect 70-80% of the people, and why that is may
only?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. But the reason it would only affect that portion are people maybe within close proximity to power sources that would be more dense or more concentrated. You'll tend to lock on to the more powerful signal with this frequency following response. In fact, we all do it, whether we really recognize it or not. The power grid that surrounds us at every instant, the only time that we really notice the difference is when the power system shuts down, and you notice how quiet it is, firstly. But if you really think about it, the first thing that then comes to mind is the body almost has a big exhale. It almost like just relaxes the system because you're no longer having to kind of create this equilibrium, and there's always this sort of underlying stress. But it's kind of like the noise in a crowded room. You know, you kind of blank it out except for the person that you're talking to right in front of you. And the body sort of does that with the background noise, if you will, of the electromagnetic fields that surround us now more intensely than ever in our history, and increasingly so.
Well, when I was reading some of the literature, I mean, was Brzezinski aware of HAARP, or was he simply putting out ideas where he thought that this type of, potential behavior control could be beneficial?
Well, he talked about it in a book called Between Two Ages. Now, that was before HAARP was ever invented, but in that he was referencing, again, J.F. Gordon MacDonald's work. But in the book Between Two Ages that he wrote while he was at Columbia University in the early 70s, before he became National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, and before, I think it was even before he started to work with Kissinger on forming the Trilateral Commission.
Yep.
But Brzezinski saw these kinds of technologies advancing and saw them being used. I mean, consider the idea of waging a silent war where you could manipulate the weather of a country, deny their food production. I mean, it makes you kind of wonder about places like Korea. It's kind of the only place on the planet, in that part of the world that just doesn't seem to be able to get enough rain to grow a turnip.
Right.
And so when you start to think about some of this, the technology's been around a long time. Even the environmental modification treaties that were signed off by the U.S. in 1977 and by many other countries before then, because we had figured out already back then the possibilities of affecting weather systems, and people were concerned because, weather systems don't respect political boundaries. I mean, they're kind of artificial lines drawn on the globe. Weather systems move across boundaries, and so whatever one country does has potential downwind effects that, again, can be totally unanticipated. So you solve one problem in one place and create, huge problems elsewhere.
Well, with the fact that there's not just one of these installations, and this is not just a United States project,
right.
I mean, it seems like we're getting closer, let's give them the benefit of the doubt for the second and say that, right now it's being used for good purposes, at least by our government. But as this technology becomes more well known and spread out, of course, there is the possibility that a rogue group could create one of these facilities and wreak havoc with it.
Well, I wouldn't trust our government.
Well, I agree.
Either. I guess,
right.
Given my experience and my family's experience in government, the government that you have is only trustworthy when it's got a vigilant population paying attention to it.
Agreed, brother.
And in this area, you have China involved in this kind of research. You have Great Britain. You have Germany. You have the Max Planck Institute, actually, that is German but based in Norway for this particular transmitter that they're utilizing. You've got Canadian government. Chinese announced their own phased array. The Russians, of course, with a long history in this area. And, when you think about energy weapons as sort of the direction of warfare, and that's what we're really talking about on all different levels, this is what the military now refers to as a revolution of military affairs. And it's happening in every respect, both in terms of not just the traditional kinds of things like computing power and robotics and drones, but energy as the source of the ordnance. In other words, instead of bombs and bullets, but using energy-based technologies is a direction that we're headed. When you think about space-based lasers and particle beams that now with some level of precision and great amounts of power can hit virtually any target on the planet. And that's where the science is headed. The idea of pacifying populations using energy that overrides the brain is an area of ongoing research, one that we'll be talking a lot about when we're down in the area lecturing this coming week. But, we wrote a book called Controlling the Human Mind, which gets into this whole issue of mind control as a concept. Even the Washington Post in January this year ran an article on the 14th of January. It was a cover story in the Washington Post magazine, a supplement to their Sunday edition, on mind effects, mind control as it relates to the average, the average Joe. Because what they did is took on people that were talking about being victims of this technology, and they dealt with some of the folks involved in the research and the science behind it, and the fact that it's even being dealt with. Sonoma State University took it on. Peter Phillips and Lou Brown and a couple of others took this subject on and issued a report earlier this year as well. And I think what we're seeing is sort of this direction being pushed a little bit harder, using sort of the current environment of fear and paranoia as a way to bring about maybe technologies that a few years ago I think most of us would have strongly resisted.
Well, that's frightening to me. Hang on just a second. Nick, my producer Jerry would like to pose a question to you as well. Hold on.
Sure.
Hi there, Nick.
Yeah.
Actually, we have an email question from James in Phoenix.
Yeah.
And he's wondering if there are uncontrolled effects on people's emotions as a result of the experiments going on at HAARP.
It's possible, but again, there's no independent monitoring, and there's lots of ways to interfere with an individual. That's the point is there was an article that the U.S. Army War College published called The Mind Has No Firewalls. It was published in Perimeters, their quarterly, back in 98 or 99. And that article lays a pretty good foundation for some of this. And what they say, in fact, I'll find the quote as we're talking. They actually talk about almost any carrier being used to get a signal that would interfere with an individual's personal performance. And and the quote goes like this. And this is from The Mind Has No Firewalls by the U.S. Army War College, and it says a psychotronic generator which produces a powerful electromagnetic emanation capable of being sent through telephone lines, TV, radio networks, supply pipes, and incandescent lamps. This signal would manipulate the behavior of those in contact with the signal. In other words, any carrier of energy can be modulated in a way that the body or mind will recognize and begin to respond to in this frequency-following response. And so it's not just HAARP, but when you think about this sort of whole direction of weapon systems, which is why we're lecturing about it these days, it's this direction and the various ways in which it can be implemented that are causing us a lot of concern, because it's exactly the kind of system that can be advanced literally from anywhere on the planet. The idea of information warfare of the 21st century, it's not going to be targeting computers, although that'll be a part of it. Ultimately, it's the operator, it's the individual that becomes the target of information warfare on all different kinds of levels.
So then, if I can understand this, people can be influenced right now without even knowing about it.
Absolutely. In fact, there was on a real simple application, they took, and this wasn't even anything really complex. They just took straight music and then below the level of hearing embedded messages to dissuade shoplifters in 7 different languages and used this in Japan, and they found a 40% reduction in shoplifting. Now, why only 40%? Well, probably they got the kinds of folks that had a conscience, and the guy that's a career shoplifter may not have responded, but the person, the kid going in to rip the store off might have been dissuaded. So hard to say why or how that actually worked, but the fact is it does, and this has been demonstrated in many different ways and many applications. But just modulations of signals was demonstrated by Smirnov on a program on CBC TV back in 97. Smirnov at the Psychocorrection Institute of the former Soviet Union showed where you could mask signals and even white noise, shoot it up to the street level, and people would respond to it. Pretty remarkable stuff.
Well, this whole idea, this whole Orwellian thing that we're talking about here, it's mind-blowing because obviously if you can affect people but still leave them in a way that they can be a healthy consumer and work and spend money, that's certainly better in the eyes of the handlers or the elites or whomever we want to call them. The infrastructure still exists without destroying cities or what have you, but it's scary as hell. And it's weird, the whole surveillance thing as well, because I was just watching television yesterday, and we're getting ready to get some additional cameras here in Los Angeles to put in intersections. And all of this, initially, I think folks see it and they think, well, what's wrong with, some surveillance cameras? Or, what's wrong with this? It's only bad people that are going to get caught or what have you. And people just do not understand the larger implication of this. And when I was saying a few minutes ago, I want to give our government the benefit of the doubt. I assure you, Nick, I'm one of those guys that listen. I'm buddies with the Loose Change guys. They've been on here. I've had Jim Mars on, so I am what the folks out there call
anti-establishment.
Well, I'm not anti-establishment. I love the United States and I love the Constitution. However, unfortunately, in this plutocracy that we now find ourselves in, people, it's easy in this climate of fear, as Nick mentioned, to get people to go along with things that are not in their best interests.
Right, and this is where when people were to say, well, I don't need to worry about, the cameras there. That's what they said when the 1930s were rolling around in Austria.
Yeah,
and the
you're
fact is, it's the guy who decides what are they going to do with the data. The guy that gets in that you may not like, who decides to use these systems to more direct and control a population. Because cameras, it's not just about shooting the film, it's about retaining the film, and then being able to look sort of backwards in history of the movements of a person over their lifetime, if you wanted to. And this is where it's eventually going. I mean, when you think about being able to collect data and use that data, right now it's the storage, but very quickly, and we know that we're hitting on the period where quantum computers have been designed and developed to a point where we know we're going to see them. This is going to change everything, because then all the data that's been stored can all of a sudden be used, manipulated, and sourced instantly. Then it's a whole different deal. And this is what people don't realize, is it's not so much what can happen today, it's how does that data get used in the future and by whom. And I think we need to be sensitive to this, because quantum computing, as a real simple formula, if you took 6.6 billion people on the planet, and you gave them each a hand calculator, and you did a calculation every 5 seconds for 60 hours, you would do what a 21st century current supercomputer would do. That's a lot of data in 1 second, what that supercomputer will do in a second. 6.6 billion people, hand calculators every 5 seconds for 60 hours. What a quantum computer does compared to that supercomputer is run that supercomputer for 1 trillion years. And think about that, with all those billions of people every second doing what they're doing. Run it for 1 trillion years, and a quantum computer will do that in an hour. Now, that means all encryption becomes obsolete, and all data immediately becomes accessible. As fast as data can flow, it can be sorted, collated, and instantly profiling virtually all the data elements within the planet. Now, that's what a quantum computer will do, and they're expecting them to be available by 2010. And I would suggest that that's going to change everything about everything, because that much computing power means that today's rate of change of about every 9 or 10 months, doubling technologies from the beginning of the wheel to where we are today, will accelerate to every few days. And that's a big jump. And when you think of the brain, complete modeling then of brain activity in real time becomes possible, as well as the generation of those very same complex signals back into another brain to impose those emotional states, mental states on others. And that's where a lot of the science is now headed on the grander scale, forgetting about something like HAARP that may be able to affect emotions, where the technology goes as these areas of science advance is in the direction that militaries are pursuing, again, without any real serious oversight in areas that should be pretty disturbing to anyone.
Absolutely. And the deal is, it's like, I've heard of HAARP, and I am what they call a conspiracy theorist, but the problem is like not that many people have heard of this technology, and even if they've heard of it, they don't understand it. And with what you're discussing now, it's if we couple surveillance, the idea of them possibly getting our DNA as well, and then then you can modify people's behavior. I mean, it is a really, really dark vision.
1984 looks like child's play compared to what we're talking about.
It is amazing.
And it's not science fiction. This is what the science of today is, and that's one of the things in all of the work we've documented over the years. And it's HAARP had over 350 sources. Controlling the Human Mind had over 300 sources. Each of these books represents a tremendous amount of background material, primarily military and government materials that are unclassified. No classified materials have ever been used, and yet the case is made to the point where you go, well, now what do we do with this technology? How do we proceed? Unfortunately, that's not the way it works right now. It's proceeding sort of along the lines of wherever government wants to take it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where there's a lot of risk. And I think that's where we start to feel, at least I personally believe, that these issues need to be at least debated, need to be looked at. And, the areas that maybe make some sense, well, let's just take our time. Why do we need to be in such a rush when there's such big stakes out there? And when you talk about the human mind, I don't think we should be involved in that at all, any more than blinding lasers or certain chemical or biological agents have been allowed. I think there are certain areas that we say, hey, wait a minute, this is off limits, and people violate it. There's no indemnification. There's people go to jail, or people have very serious consequences for invading the purview of free consciousness. I think it should be capital crime to invade on some gross basis for anybody's purposes without consent the human mind of individuals.
I agree with that entirely, but Nick, you're being far too rational.
Well,
just kidding.
Here's the thing. You said you're a conspiracy theorist.
I hate that term, but I don't know.
And I'll tell you why. Because the military, if you stop and think about it, that's their job. Their job is to think about every scary thing that could ever happen and build a plan around it. That makes them the conspiracy theorist, and I'm glad they are, but they don't need to be in charge.
That's right. You guys, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back for our final segment with Dr. Nick Begich. I've enjoyed this one a lot so far. You guys hang in there. We're going to be right back. Nick, in these final few minutes, I've got two things I have to ask you about, and you told me on one of these it's not something that you researched, but I just can't resist because I have to ask you this. One has to do with chemtrails, and I've heard a lot of people put forth the ideas that perhaps HAARP is being used in with the chemtrails to a certain do you think that's the case at all?
I've heard this, but I've not seen any documents that would support it. It doesn't mean that it's not possible. I just haven't seen it. And for us, it's always the documents that matter. There's been a lot of these kind of clandestine sort of conversations around chemtrails, and I don't use that as evidence. Others might. I prefer to see hard paper. Using HAARP for weather modification, sure, absolutely, it's in the literature. You don't need anything else to do that. Affecting human behavior, you don't need anything else to do that. The idea of modulating a signal that would interact with specific chemicals, yeah, you can do that. But again, I think if you're talking about getting chemicals into a person, there's better ways to get uniform dosages. That certainly isn't one of them. Spraying in the air, although it's been done before. There were some studies done in the early 60s where they sprayed viral material over population centers to see how viruses would spread. But again, I don't see a connection, not directly. And if there's paperwork or documents out there that would draw one, I'd certainly like to see them.
So you don't feel like the chemicals that are supposedly in chemtrails, like barium and magnesium and aluminum and all that, is necessary for any more hyperconductivity within the atmosphere than is already being created by HAARP already?
Well, number one, the barium can be accounted for lots of different things. The sampling that's taken place is not at the point of discharge; it's just in the atmosphere. And
Okay.
the question is where did the material come from? Barium is injected into the atmosphere deliberately because then when you use HAARP and certain RF signals, you can create a lighting up effect where the magnetic field lines will show up. So that's done routinely. Aluminum and barium also enter the environment from a couple of different natural and man-made sources. There's two major dust flows, one from the North African region that actually delivers aluminum particulate material throughout the eastern United States, what accounts for a lot of the orange coloration within the soils in that part of the country. In the Asia also accounts for lots of heavy metals and pollutants at a huge unprecedented level that blows from northern Canada on the west coast all the way down into Mexico on the west coast. And there's what there isn't enough of in the Midwest, where a lot of aluminum was reported, happens to be the upper Midwest, lower portions of Canada, where huge bauxite processing was done, aluminum processing was done, and before the Clean Air Act, all that colloidal material went up the stacks, and now every time the wind blows, it blows too. The problem is sampling, and there's some things going on, but the sampling is sloppy. There's not enough discounting for what else might be potential sources. But when you start to think about these heavy metals and particulate materials, and then you think about electromagnetic field effects, there's cause for concern, whether they're deliberate, natural, or intended. And that gets into some of the work of Becker when he wrote Cross Currents in the Body Electric, and was talking about certain chemicals within the body or getting into the body, and then external signals that resonate with those chemicals, tricking the body into thinking it's been poisoned. You can do it with virtually any element and then bring a signal in from the outside. So when you start introducing lots of new things that are getting ingested into the body, along with energy fields that either deliberately or accidentally can trigger some pretty horrendous effects, look at the population. I mean, think about stress-related disorders, think about autism increases, think about all the things that are going on with populations that can be related to chemical poisonings, that can be related to general stress, and these things can be connected, I believe, to what we're discharging generally in the environment, as well as now the energy interactions with these chemicals and compounds.
My God. Well, that brings me to my next question, and Jerry, my producer, and I kind of thought of this at the same time, because just a couple of weeks ago we did a show on this whole situation with the disappearing honeybees.
Right.
And this idea of the earth and kind of the acupuncture kind of way of looking at it, that we have meridians or ley lines or whatever folks want to call them. Do you think, what is your take on this whole bee situation? I mean, do you think that any of this could be related to that? I mean, because some folks have thought that, they can't navigate in the manner that they used to. Some folks think it's, GM seeds or what have you. Do you have any particular opinion on this?
Could be a combination of things, but again, most species, and now that they start to look at this, they believe that species are already against magnetic field lines of the planet when they navigate, whether they're salmon spawning or migratory birds or bees or what have you, that the navigation mechanism is orientation against magnetic field lines. When you look at various wavelengths, interference with navigation systems, this is very possible. In fact, microwave transmission signals that happen to be the same wavelength as a needle length of a specific tree in Europe was dying off, and they equated it to that. When you think about the bees' antenna length in the millimeter range, possibly something generating millimeter waves that it would interfere with that. That's very possible and plausible if we believe in that model of navigation for these various kinds of creatures. And I think that's what the science supports when you start to introduce, huge amounts of cell phone interactions and wireless interactions. Could be very easily these things are now interfering to a point where these navigations interfere with, or even considering natural causes. In other words, the increase in solar activity creating other things. we're really just, when you think about observed science for these kinds of events, it's all relatively new over long periods of time. We just don't have enough knowledge. But I believe it's energetic actions interfering with navigation. There was a short article came out suggesting maybe cell phones were involved,
right, I saw
cell
that.
towers. And a few days before that, we had talked about that in a lecture we had just given in Ashland, Oregon, that same week. And it's all very possible, and these are exactly the kinds of things that we would expect to see more of as we introduce increasing amounts of energy into what otherwise was once a wireless world without any of this.
Well, when I was looking at the literature, I mean, I noticed that HAARP could affect migratory.
Right.
That's, man. I mean, that alone should give people pause.
Right.
Well, I don't know.
Again, when you think about salmon interruptions and salmon spawning, there's a lot of controversy with Canada over that a few years ago, and some said, well, maybe it was HAARP. Maybe it was. The fact is, there are a lot of things going on, both in the air and in the sea. Now we have the underwater sonars that may be impacting migration patterns as well for other reasons. But when you look at these things and you start to consider that underlying all of these physical events are energetic interactions, and manipulating those are what the science of this century, both for weapons applications, communications, and other means, are being advanced. At the same time, they offer incredible potentials for human beings and for our existence on the planet that get ignored because it's done, unfortunately, too often in secret.
That's truly a shame. And this almost, in my mind, in some respects, brings me full circle to the idea initially when you were talking about the exploration of natural gas and oil. It's like if there were ever a time where a technology of this manner could be assistance to the security of the United States as opposed to a threat to it.
Right, right.
Holy cow.
And this is the sad story, is, when I say the military are paranoid thinkers, it is their job to think of all the horrible circumstances and guard against them. But you don't want them too far out front in terms of organizing your national policy. And we've seen the military-industrial academic complex really go out front on everything these days to the point where the other applications in science get either missed, ignored, or just never come to the forefront for fear of the sinister side being sort of released as well. But I think that's what we need to change. I mean, when we're talking about science now that can affect the whole planet in such profound ways, we need a way to discuss them. We don't have to talk about how to build the stuff, so we don't disclose some national secret. But at least conceptually, we ought to be talking about what we can do just so we make sure the proper safeguards are in place. Or in some instances, we flat just make the decision not to do things because we just can't be safe.
We've got about a minute and a half. I have to ask you this one last question, Nick. In some of the literature, and I don't remember where I saw this, there were folks that even thought that the blackout that we had a couple of years ago in the Northeast perhaps could have been caused by some HAARP activity. Is that what do you think?
Well, interference with the power grid is one of those possibilities
Certainly.
that does show up in the literature. It is possible. Back during the early woodpecker signal back in the 70s, the Soviet transmitters were thought to have caused power failures in central Canada. Many will remember that. Manipulating the ionosphere, the magnetic field lines, creating some kind of planetary arcing, if you will. Is it possible? Some think so. I mean, the problem is we've never had this kind of technology in this kind of control ever before in our history, and again, why we need to be careful. We're ramping it up this year. We're increasing the power significantly. Pay attention. We may see some fireworks yet. Hopefully not, because the risks are huge.
Thank you so much, Nick, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And you guys, if you're in Southern California, please come out to MUFON LA and MUFON OC and see Dr. Nick Begich speak this week, Tuesday and Wednesday night. My name is Michael Parker. Till next week, don't be afraid of the dark. Just listen to it.